He screwed up big time, and there was no doubt about it. His hands looked horrifying. There were some thin outgrowths coming out of his skin. It was like something was trying to break free. Sue looked at his palm in shock. There was a strange flower sprawling on his palm. The story begins in a small town in South Korea. Song Ho-jun swung sharply and shouted, "Fire throw!" The ball flew out of his hands and straight into Gino's head. The whole class burst into laughter. Song Ho-jun turned to his friends and said with a smirk that he had hit the target. Dong Hyuk laughed and added that he gets a point for throwing like that. Chae Hyo snorted and called Gino a sucker. The head elder shook her head and whispered to Shin-soo, not understanding what was wrong with these guys and why they really thought it was funny. Then she glanced at Gino and said quietly that he wasn't even trying to defend himself, as if he had already given up completely. The bullies handed the ball to the girl in the last desk and told her to throw it at Gino. The brunette squinted her eyes calmly, picked up the ball and took confident aim. Shin-soo, still picking at a pimple on his chin, lazily remarked that Gino was really dumb, putting up with all this every day and keeping quiet. The ball hit Gino's cheek with a thud. The brunette laughed to the whole class. Gino grabbed his face. At this time, Shin-soo said that he himself would have fought back long ago, even if he was ashamed afterward. Dong-hyuk laughed loudly and shouted for Gino to become. According to him, if he didn't catch it, he wouldn't survive. Gino was sweating with fear, drops dripping down his forehead. The bully raised his arm and swung. He was going to throw with all his might. The first to realize everything was the headmistress. She saw that the ball was flying straight at Gino. Head girl Yoo Eun-ha shouted, "Sue, watch out!" He turned around, but it was too late. The ball was flying straight at him. The bully was aiming at Gino, but he instinctively raised his arm, and the ball ricocheted into Sue's forehead. The ball bounced and crashed into someone's backpack. One of the guys laughed, calling what was happening a real double kill, while another added that there should definitely be double points for something like that. The headman put his hand on Sue's shoulder and asked reproachfully if they even realized that they had just hit a person. The bullies laughed, stating that if their dear Ginny hadn't twitched, nothing would have happened. Sue jumped up, clenched his fists, and roared with rage, demanding to know which one of them had thrown that ball. The guys looked at each other. There was so much anger in Sue's voice that many of them felt uncomfortable. Dong-hyuk grabbed Gino by the collar, yanked him forward, and charged. It was all him. Then he just pushed him away. Sue stared at them intently, full of rage, waiting for some sort of response. Dong-hyuk looked away, apologized briefly, patted Gino on the shoulder, and told him to bow. He then took a step toward Shin-soo and held out his hand, demanding the ball back. There was silence in the classroom. Everyone felt that something serious was brewing. Sue looked at him in confusion, not knowing how to react. Dong-hyuk frowned and repeated that he wasn't kidding. He demanded the ball back right now. Sue turned his back and heard the threat. If he continued to show off, they would definitely get to him. He silently picked up the ball and squeezed it until his fingers ached. Yoo Eun-ha didn't take her eyes off him. Her face was tense. Sue stood in front of everyone and slowly looked around the classroom. He looked calm, but inside, there was a storm, and he was already holding the ball like a weapon. It wasn't because of Gino. It wasn't about feeling sorry for him. It wasn't for the headman's sake. It was just a pimple bursting, and patience along with it. Sue threw up his hand and threw the ball directly at Dong-hyuk with fury. Gino screamed in fear. Sue shouted too, loudly, not holding back. Everyone froze. No one believed that someone had actually challenged Dong-hyuk. The ball smashed into Dong-hyuk's face with a thud. The class shuddered. He staggered, almost collapsed, but held on. Head girl Yoo Eun-ha looked at Sue in shock. He was trembling. His whole body was electrocuted. Sue hissed through his teeth, asking if the man had gone crazy, and added how much the man pissed him off. The class started to murmur. Someone shouted that Sue was crazy and out of his mind. But Dong-hyuk raised his hand, stood between Sue and the others, and firmly stated that it was between him and Sue. Dong-hyuk grabbed his black eye, his face twisted with rage. He lunged at Sue, ran up close, swung around and shouted a threat, calling him a creature. Sue didn't even have time to realize what was happening. He just froze in place. The next second he was thrown sideways. One of the slippers was left lying on the floor. He hit his head hard. Without stopping, Dong-hyuk began to land stiff leg kicks one after another. With each blow, it was as if light bulbs were flashing in Sue's head. He thought that this was the survival technique. The inner voice continued. This is how the errand boys feel, or the ones who everyone just pulls from. Everything went quiet. A couple minutes later, class started. The teacher walked into the classroom with a box, placed it on the table, and announced that today they would be studying the Blob, Physarum polygonum. Turns out this slime ball can do a bunch of weird features. It digests food without internal organs and memorizes information even though it doesn't even have a brain. It can regenerate. Also, if two slime balls get together, they share memories. Everyone was yawning in the boring class, except for the bullies. One of them leaned over to Sue and suggested with a chuckle, "Let him check the Talk." Shin-Soo didn't hesitate and took out his phone. In the chat, Sun Ho-jun wrote that Sue is now the second errand boy, and Dong Yeok added that it's a shame the sticker isn't centered. It would look cooler if it was. Sue hissed through clenched teeth, barely containing his anger. Gino looked at them in surprise, hearing laughter erupt behind his back. The teacher was saying something, but no one was listening. Half the class giggled quietly, looking at Sue. On a yellow sticker taped to his shirt was neatly inscribed, "Let's be friends." Sue ripped the sticker off his back and clenched it in his fist so hard that his fingers turned white. The teacher in the background kept muttering something like, "This creature is even exhibited in national zoos." The bell rang. Class was over. Everyone started to pack their backpacks and noisily walk out of the school. On the way out, the guys stopped for a smoke. Dong Yeok took out a cigarette and held it out to Sue. Sue looked away and quietly said he didn't want to. There was a tense silence. Dong Yeok was the first to break the silence, and he said he had a question to ask. He took a step forward, rested his forehead against Sue's forehead, and bellowed angrily why he had thrown the ball at him. Dong Yeok squinted, and already calmer, added that he really wondered why Sue had done that. Dong Yeok's friends began to tease him, laughing loudly and encouraging him to put that one in his place. Dong Yeok abruptly cut them off, ordering them to shut up. He wanted to hear what Sue had to say himself. Sue exhaled confusedly. The ball flew into his face, breaking his zit, and he freaked out, throwing the ball back. He lowered his gaze and added quietly that he was just sorry for what had happened. But that kind of answer didn't satisfy Dong Yeok at all. He leaned over sharply and smacked Sue's forehead with all his might. Sue collapsed to the ground. Dong Yeok grinned and was pleased to notice that the man's teeth seemed to have crunched. Gino had just come out of the school and froze, looking at what was happening in shock. Dong Yeok turned to him with a smile. "Oh, Ginny, it's no fun at all without you." The hooligans ran up to Gino, kicked him, and demanded money. Dong Yeok was already looking at his own, irritated that they were behaving like this without a command. Dong Yeok grabbed Sue by the hair and looked at Gino and asked if he had done what he asked. Gino, stammering nervously, replied that yes, he did. Dong Yeok immediately began to strike Sue's head without letting go of his hair. Gino handed Dong Yeok a jar of the slime ball they'd seen in class. Dong Yeok laughed as he looked into the jar and exclaimed that it was really amazing. Gino brought the slime ball as requested. Dong Yeok said he had watched the creature before and thought it was cool, but he wasn't sure if it was an animal or a plant. One of the guys offered to take the slime ball out of the jar. Dong Yeok, deciding he knew exactly what to do with it, opened the jar. He said it would be interesting to see if the slime mold would come out if you ate it, and a couple minutes later, the slime mold was in a glass of water. Dong Yeok placed the glass in front of the boys and declared that whoever drank it first would be more than just an errand boy for him. He held Gino's money in his hands and added that he was bound to win, for he had put all his money on the line. Gino and Sue tensed up. The stakes were too high. Feeling like a toy. It was a disgusting feeling. Unlike Sue, Gino was determined, as if he was already used to such situations. The bullies kept insisting that Gino drink the drink. Seeing that Sue wasn't ready, Dong Yeok shouted that maybe he should beat him before he started. The hooligans, prepared for the show, shouted, "On your mark! Attention!" In an instant, memories of today flashed before Sue's eyes. He felt that pain again as Dong Yeok brutally beat him with his legs. Sue remembered that note where the bullies had teased, suggesting that they become friends. Suddenly the hooligans gave the command, "March!" Gino rushed forward as soon as he heard the command. Sue looked at him in surprise. But a second later, Sue pushed Gino in the back, giving him no chance to win. Gino felt a terrible pain and lost his balance. When Gino fell down, having exhausted all his strength, Sue rushed forward without wasting any time. Dong Yeok laughed loudly, and without holding back his emotions, he shouted out that it was awesome. Sue ran up to the jar with that strange slime mold and pushed it so hard that the entire contents spilled out. He walked up to Dong Yeok, clenched his teeth with rage, and swung his fist. Sue didn't hesitate. His fist struck Dong Yeok's cheek with all his might. The bully flew backward at high speed. Sue clenched his teeth. His gaze was icy, full of determination. Dong Yeok cried out at the top of his voice in unbearable pain as his body shuddered from the impact. Dong Yeok fell to the ground and looked down in bewilderment. Meanwhile, one of Dong Yeok's friends jumped on Sue, waving his arms, and shouted that he was a crazy lunatic, intending to hit him. At this moment, someone from behind grabbed Sue's clothes tightly. While a classmate plucked a strand of hair from his hair, someone behind him pulled Sue toward him, holding his uniform. Dong Yeok completely seized the initiative, grabbed onto the collar with both hands, and yanked harder. Raising his knee, Dong Yeok roughly kicked Sue in the stomach. Sue opened his mouth and cried out in sharp pain. The main bully glared angrily at Sue and hissed, "Scum!" Dong Yeok changed stance and kicked Sue's leg, knocking him off balance. Sue panicked. He realized he was falling, but there was nothing he could do about it. Gino stood back and looked on in shock at what was happening. Dong-hyuk successfully pushed Shin-soo off his feet, and he collapsed to the ground with a thunderous crash. Leaning over, Dong-hyuk grabbed Soo's wrist and swung his left hand while his friends laughed and videotaped what was happening. He shouted that Soo had asked for the fight himself. The bullies were laughing loudly and discussing Soo. One of them said the one had a head like a steel pot. Sung Ho-jun looked at Gino and, pointing at Soo, asked if the latter had hit Gino. Gin looked away excitedly, and after a couple seconds stammering, admitted that it was his own fault for being too clumsy. Suddenly, Dong-hyuk's loud voice sounded. He called out to Gino. Dong-hyuk ordered Gino to quickly fetch what fell out of the glass, and Gino immediately ran without looking back. While the bullies laughed at how quickly he obeyed, Gino began picking up the slime ball with his hands. As soon as the slime ball was collected, Gino immediately ran up to Dong-hyuk. Dong-hyuk snatched the slime ball from his hands with a sharp movement. After that, he squeezed Soo's hair vigorously and, showing the slime ball, ordered him to eat it. Dong-hyuk looked at Soo threateningly and said he had a choice. He could either eat the stuff himself, or Dong-hyuk would knock his teeth out and force everything in. Soo looked at the slime ball, hesitated, and realizing that there was no way out, he leaned over and took a small bite. One of the guys started videotaping it while the rest of us watched in disgust. Dong-hyuk squeezed Soo's hair harder and shouted that if he tried to spit it out, he would regret it. Shin-soo continued to bite off and slowly chew on the slime ball. At one point, he couldn't stand it and started crying. Then he lowered his head and burst into tears aloud, unable to contain himself. Dong-hyuk stepped back a bit and stood with his back to him, looking somewhere to the side. Fixing his hair, he said aloud what he thought of Soo and came to one conclusion. Abruptly turning around, Dong-hyuk kicked Soo's shoulder with force and shouted, "You're pissing me the hell off." Soo rolled his eyes and whimpered in searing pain. While Soo was lying on the ground exhaustedly, Dong-hyuk said that he was really making him angry. He glanced at his wristwatch, then flicked an angry glance at Soo again. Dong-hyuk turned to his gang and said it was time to disperse to their homes. Ho-jun worriedly asked if they were really going to leave so easily, since Soo didn't even move. Dong-hyuk took out a cigarette, turned around, looked at Soo and grinned. He said that no one cared what was wrong with this idiot. The boys walked back a little. When they stopped, Dong-hyuk said that people don't die that easily, so there was nothing to worry about. Then he went up to a classmate and demanded his winnings money, but the guy with glasses didn't want to give it back. Reminded him that Dong-hyuk made Soo eat a slime ball, and that wasn't fair. Dong-hyuk abruptly snatched the money out of the guy's hands and, counting it out, frowned at him for not being in the mood. Suddenly, he heard someone's footsteps behind him. Looking around, he first noticed a black shadow. Taking a closer look, Dong-hyuk and the others realized it was Soo. Only now he looked more like a zombie than a human. Everyone stared at Shin-soo fearfully, but Dong-hyuk only smiled widely and said that Soo appeared to still be alive. He pulled out his baton and grinned, saying that he had just beaten him badly, so he was pretending to be a zombie to scare him. Gino stood back and watched in horror as Soo came closer and closer to Dong-hyuk. Dong-hyuk looked at him with a crazed look and shouted to him to not slow down and approach faster. As he came closer, Soo stood in a fighting stance, clenched his eyes, and struck his fist towards Dong-hyuk with all his might. He wanted to end this once and for all. At the same moment, Dong-hyuk raised his baton and swung it, shouting what a bastard Soo was. Not much time has passed since those events. Gino made it home without any problems. He left his green sneakers on the doorstep, immediately went to the refrigerator and took a sedative. He exhaled heavily, remembering everything that had happened at school. On my way to the room, I pulled out my phone and started flipping through the pictures. Gino stared at the screen of his phone, looking at the photo of the slime ball. Walking into the room, he sat down on the bed and thought for a moment. He remembered how Soo had lunged at Dong-hyuk and tried to hit him. He's really tough, Gino thought. After a second, he reached into his backpack and pulled out something important. Inside the dark blue pencil case lay the very thing, yellow slime mold. Gino took it in his hands, examined it closely, and suddenly laughed loudly. He didn't take his eyes off it. The slime ball seemed somehow beautiful to him. At this time, Soo was still lying on the ground without moving. Suddenly, the phone rang from his pocket. Soo opened his eyes slightly, fiddled with his hand, and took out his phone. Soo picked up the phone and heard the familiar voice of the headman. The girl was afraid for him. She called him many times, but he didn't answer. Today he even missed school, and she was worried. When the head teacher asked why he missed school, Soo replied that it was his own business, and he was entitled to some rest. The headman worriedly interrogated what was going on with him and why he was acting like this. After thinking for a bit, the girl added that she was worried. "Soo, you didn't do anything serious, right?" Soo grabbed his head and replied that he had done nothing wrong. Then he asked why she was meddling in his personal affairs. The girl calmly replied that it was important for her to know since she was the head girl. When the bus pulled up to the bus stop, the head teacher told Soo that they would see her at school tomorrow and hung up the phone. Sue walked over to the glass and looked at his reflection. Seeing how much his facial features had changed, Sue felt that he had become like a monster. He screamed loudly in fright, and when he jerked, he dropped the phone. The phone dropped loudly on the floor next to Sue's sneakers. He crouched down, leaning on the sign with one hand and trying to reach for his phone with the other. Picking up the phone, Sue looked at his reflection in the glass again. His eye was a huge, bright yellow, and it was immediately noticeable. Sue noticed that the nose, although still the same, now looked different from normal people. The same was true of the lips. His whole face was upside down. Eyes, eyebrows, ears, nose, mouth. Everything was in chaos, like a monster from fairy tales. Looking at his distorted reflection, Sue wondered how many times he had been beaten to look like this. Some time passed. Everyone in the class was working except Gino. Gino stared nervously at the empty desk where Shinsu usually sat. The head teacher was worried too. She noticed that Shinsu was no longer coming to school. Meanwhile, Shinsu heard his mom calling him and asking him to open the door. The woman kept knocking and scolding him for not opening. Shinsu, unable to bear it, shouted that he was asleep. His mom asked why he wasn't going to school and assumed something was wrong. She asked him to tell her. Then she raised her voice a little and reminded me that today was the school's anniversary. Shinsu was shocked, but at that moment, he noticed the slime ball starting to come out from under him. Quickly covering the slime ball with a blanket, he did his best to conceal it. Mom called out to him again and he replied, "Oh, come on." My mom went to the door, reminding me to eat and not to watch any weird stuff. Shinsu sighed in relief as he hid the slime ball outgrowths under the blanket. Shinsu tilted his head and quietly turned to his mom. As soon as he heard the door close, he shouted at the top of his voice that he was in no condition to be seen. Suddenly, memories of how Dong-hyuk had forcefully made him eat the strange plant flashed before his eyes. Tears came to my eyes and a real anger and desire for revenge flared up in my soul. Shinsu looked at his hands and cried out that there was no point in him now knowing the cause of his condition. The whole room was filled with these strange outgrowths. Overwhelmed with anger, Shinsu clenched his hands into fists. Unable to contain himself, he slammed his fists down hard on the offshoots and screamed that none of this would help him get back to normal. The offshoots even wrapped around a painting of little Shinsu, but soon the offshoots began to rampage and move around the apartment as if they couldn't settle down. Shinsu cried out in pain as the outgrowths began to hide inside his body. Shinsu couldn't bear the pain and fell off the bed right onto the floor. Meanwhile, the normal school day continued at the school. Sung Ho-jun hugged Gino and walked with him to the head of the school gang. The head showed the boys the stale bread he had left in the cupboard. When Dong-hyuk handed the bread to Gino, he asked in surprise if it wasn't the bread he had bought a month ago. He asked if he should eat the bread. Dong-hyuk looked at Gino carefully and asked if he wanted him to eat that bread. Dong-hyuk smiled widely, and a spark flashed in his crazy eyes as he uttered, "Mission, feed this to Shinsu." Gino froze in amazement at hearing such a task. A group of girls intervened in the conversation. One of them asked Dong-hyuk what he was going to do if Shinsu ended up in the hospital because of him. If that happened, he would have to face the police. Dong-hyuk turned to the girls and threateningly said that if they didn't shut up, they would have to taste this bread too. The girls awkwardly looked at Dong-hyuk and immediately fell silent. Sung Ho-jun asked the girls to stay out of it with their stupid advice. Dong-hyuk, exasperated, handed the spoiled bread to Gino. At this time, Shinsu was rushing towards the school while talking to the head teacher on the phone. When the girl wouldn't stop asking questions, Shinsu couldn't stand it and yelled out that he was almost there, but was late because he was sick. The girl asked if he had gone to the hospital and told about the teacher's request for a certificate. Shinsu irritably replied that he didn't have time to get the certificate. He promised to bring it after school. He wondered if he should go to the lab first to find out exactly what kind of slime mold it was. Yoon-ha reminded that if Shinsu wants to write the final exam, he should hurry up. Shinsu sarcastically pointed out that talking about the exam when he almost died was beneath criticism. The girl calmly stated that Shinsu probably just wanted to share with her that studying wasn't his concern. At this moment, outgrowths began to appear on his arms. While the head teacher was asking if Shinsu's mom knew that he wasn't at school yesterday, the offshoots were getting bigger and bigger. The tips of these offshoots began to darken rapidly. After a moment, the offshoots began to break off. Shinsu looked at his hand and cursed out loud. The headmistress, listening in surprise to his screams through the phone, couldn't figure out what was going on. At this time, Chae-hyo hit Gino's stomach with a swing, and he flew aside without holding back. Yoon-ha opened the classroom door and Gino suddenly flew straight towards her. An instant later, Gino slammed into the girl. Both of them cried out in pain, and the headman's phone fell out of his hands. Chae-hyo walked up to Gino and swung around and shouted that he was a real fool. He kicked Gino in the cheek and he wailed in pain, realizing that Chae-hyo had completely lost his conscience. Taking a fighting stance, Chae-hyo started throwing punches with his fists, shouting that Gino was completely out of his mind. Gino, holding his head and breathing heavily, shouted in the same breath that everyone here was crazy. Dong-hyuk laughed out loud, and Dae-yeol, looking at Chae-hyo in surprise, asked, "Are you out of your mind?" At that second, the headman intervened in the fight, trying to protect Gino. She stepped between them and asked Chae-hyo to stop, asking what Gino had done that everyone was bugging him about and threatening to tell the teacher. Chae-hyo looked away and replied irritably, saying that the headman was annoyed with him. Then he sharply pushed the head woman aside, telling her to fuck off. They were doing fine without her. Chae-hyo walked over to Gino, and addressing the headman, said he wanted to talk to his friend without her interference. He added that something personal needs to be discussed. Standing at the entrance of Beck's school, Shin-soo noticed that his hand was still trembling. He looked at the building and thought that Dong-hyuk would definitely start bullying again. Dong-hyuk has been the most famous figure in the neighborhood since middle school. They say one guy was beaten up just for being from a rich family. Tot couldn't stand it and went to the juvenile detention center after school. Everyone knew. Dong-hyuk had handled 2 adults. No one had touched him since then. Looking at the school, Shin-soo realized he just hated it. Everything was clenching inside. He wondered if the soldiers felt the same way before they returned to duty. Even earlier, when Gino was shown stale bread, Chae-hyo said, "Since Shin-soo got the mushroom, you eat the bread." Gino raised his head, rested his forehead against Chae-hyo's forehead, and told him not to tell him what to do. Sung Ho-jun put his hand on Gino's shoulder. The guys started laughing, and Gino said sarcastically that he was terribly scared. At the same moment, he sharply pushed Ho-jun away. Shouting to back off, Gino ripped the glasses off Chae-hyo's face. The guys laughed out loud. The glasses sat on him in the most ridiculous way possible. Chae-hyo corrected them, but he wasn't going to pretend that nothing had happened. The lenses were cloudy. He took off his glasses and examined them, and Gino apologized. He didn't mean to push so hard. After wiping and putting his glasses back on, Chae-hyo calmly said that Gino was out of line, and promptly elbowed him in the head so hard that Gino's heart hoop flew off. Gino fell down and Chae-hyo started beating him up. The others just watched. The headmistress had tried to intervene before, but to no avail. Now she decided to try again. The headman punched Chae-hyo in the back of the head with all his might and yelled for him to stop immediately. She looked him in the eye and said if he was so tough, let him hit her too. Dae-yeol moved closer and told Chae-hyo that he should chill out before the teacher came. Dong-hyuk laughed and threw in, saying, "Chae-hyo should be ashamed. He was taught a lesson by the headman." At that moment, the door to the classroom swung open. Shin-soo stood on the threshold. Everyone fell silent at once. No one expected him to show up. Gino rose slowly, holding onto the door. He could barely stand on his feet. Shin-soo looked at him and asked what happened. Gino only replied tiredly for him to move away. The headman walked over to Shin-soo and told him to just sit back down. As he walked to his desk, he could feel everyone in the class keeping an eye on him. Chae-hyo threw out that Shin-soo is a tough guy. Dong-hyuk beat him up like that, but he's still in one piece like nothing happened. Dong-hyuk rolled his eyes and told Chae-hyo to cut the crap and get on with Gino, who still hadn't gotten his portion of bread. Shin-soo sat down at his desk. The hunger suddenly came over him with renewed vigor. He had eaten before school after all, but now it felt like he hadn't eaten in a week. One of his classmates sat up to him and started telling him what the beating of Gino was about. Hearing this, Shin-soo clenched his fists. He realized that Gino had been treated the same way he had once been treated. The thought of Dong-hyuk trying to feed him rotten bread only made him angry. Unable to bear it, Shin-soo stood up. He turned around and walked straight towards Dong-hyuk. Dong-hyuk tilted his head slightly and asked Shin-soo what he was going to do. Shin-soo calmly took the spoiled bread from his desk. He said he would eat it himself. He took off the package and asked Dong-hyuk to forget about yesterday. Dong-hyuk frowned and interrogated Soo. "What did you just say?" Shin-soo opened his mouth, preparing for the first bite. And the next moment he was gnawing into bread covered in green mold. There was silence in the classroom. Everyone stared at him in stunned disbelief. Shin-soo didn't pay attention. He knew that if he didn't do it himself, Gino would still break. Swallowing piece after piece, he hoped for only one thing, that Gino would understand and thank him. Chewing on another piece, Shin-soo thought for a second. Oddly enough, the bread turned out surprisingly tasty. Loud laughter erupted in the classroom. Dong-hyuk was literally laughing. He looked at Shin-soo and asked with a sneer, wondering if the latter had decided that they were now equals. Then Dong-hyuk shouted, "Are you out of your mind? Do you have no idea what's going on?" In the next second, his fist flew right into Shin-soo's face. Everyone in the class froze, unable to believe their eyes. Sung Ho-jun turned to Dong-hyuk and Chae-hyo with a smirk, and said that they decided to cheer up the school day. Dae-yeol interjected into the conversation, adding that there was something more interesting here. He pointed at Shin-soo and said that asshole had just fended off Dong-hyuk's punch. Dong-hyuk's fist came within a centimeter of his eye, but Shin-soo managed to stop him. The class froze. No one could believe it. Shin-soo didn't just withstand the blow, he intercepted it. Shin-soo himself looked at Dong-hyuk fearfully. He didn't even move. His hand worked itself out. It seemed as if it had a life of its own. As he held Dong-Hyuk's fist, strange slime-like growths began to stretch along his fingers. Dong-Hyuk yanked his hand back in fury and immediately swung again. But Shin-Soo caught the blow again, still with the same hand. Slime appeared again, now from the palm of his hand itself. Shin-Soo felt uneasy. Dong-Hyuk noticed this and frowned. "Hey, what's wrong with your arm?" Dong-Hyuk reached out to Shin-Soo and motioned for him to come over so he could watch. Shin-Soo instinctively pressed his hand against his other hand and abruptly recoiled. "No, I won't go near it." He realized that if he didn't leave now, things could get much worse. Soo felt someone touch his shoulder. He turned around and saw Dong-Hyuk's two cronies behind him. While those distracted, Dong-Hyuk snuck up and abruptly grabbed Soo's arm. Dong-Hyuk angrily ordered Soo to unclench his fist. The bullies surrounded Soo, and Dong-Hyuk squeezed Soo's hand tighter. Suddenly, the boys heard someone call them chooks. It was Oh-Jun. He came closer and said that he actually even liked this class. One of the upperclassmen snorted and said he didn't belong here because he looked like a pig. Oh-Jun calmly replied that then he and the boys would have to fight their way into the stable on their own, especially since they didn't have anything to eat. He walked almost right up to Dong-Hyuk and called out loudly. Afterward, he said that Jeop was going back to school. Dong-Hyuk let go of Soo, looked at Oh-Jung, and said that now it was clear why it was quiet. Then he added, "Didn't that asshole get suspended?" Oh-Jun explained that Jeop had a conflict with the Gomungo guys. He taught them a lesson. The beaten guys filed a police report, and the case almost ended in jail. But even on probation, Jeop snapped again and showed up at their place on his own. Dong-Hyuk grimaced and said that he didn't like the type at all, but admitted that the guy was really something. Oh-Jun said that if Jeop refuses to play, then everyone will have to answer. He then pulled Soo's cheek, and looking at Dong-Hyuk, he asked him to stop playing with his anchovies and treat them kindly. He pulled Soo's cheek again as if drawing a smile and said that he looked too sad. Continuing to pull his cheek, Oh-Jun asked if he had gotten fat. Then he added that his cheek stretched like a rubber band. Soo was angry but was shocked that no one in the class was even paying attention. Still, he was glad. The main bullies weren't interested in him anymore. He didn't want to have anything to do with them. While he silently tolerated the touch on his cheek, his hand suddenly twitched on its own and sharply pushed Oh-Jung away. "It's all because of the slime ball that's taken control again." Soo turned sharply pale. He was frightened by what had just happened. Oh-Jun cried out in pain and turned around to his friends, asking who the asshole even was. At this moment, the head teacher entered the classroom and asked Shin-Soo what was going on here. The bullies glanced over. It seemed to them that Soo was extending his fist strangely. The previously calm Oh-Jun suddenly became furious. He grabbed Soo's collar and squeezed it tightly, threatening that he would regret it if he decided to fight with him. He brought his fist up sharply and almost struck, but stopped when he heard Dong-Hyuk shout loudly. Oh-Jun froze and looked at Dong-Hyuk in surprise. Dong-Hyuk angrily asked how he even dared to touch someone from this class without his permission. It's been hours. Dong-Hyuk's friends were standing against the wall, waiting for Jeop. They were shocked to see that he didn't come alone but with two idiots. When they met, the brunette said that Jeop looked cool as always. The man only snorted and said he was aware of that. Jeop asked where Dong-Hyuk was. The brunette replied that he and the others had already gathered for the game. Jeop walked up to his group who were waiting for him. One of the guys noticed that he and his friends hadn't been around for a while. Jeop looked up and said that school was the best place. He looked confident as if he was coming home. While the guys were dumbfoundedly silent, Jeop announced that all restrictions were lifted and it was time to get back to business. That's when one of the school children approached him, held up the Galaxy S2 in his hands, and asked if Jeopa was interested in something like that. Jeop picked up the phone, looked at it, and mockingly asked, "Are you going to the other world? Why didn't you even bring a decent thing with you?" He threw the Galaxy S2 back into the hands of the prancing man, and one of his friends suggested he just throw it away and not embarrass himself. Sung Ho-jun and Dae-yeol politely said hello to Jeop, calling him brother, and asked how he was doing. At this time, Dong-Hyuk heard someone call his name and turned around. One of Jeop's friends, with a black mask pulled down from his face, abruptly grabbed Dong-Hyuk by the hair and said he needed to say hello to Jeop. Dong-Hyuk looks up and says that he wasn't thinking anything bad. He's convinced that he was just waiting for the guys to get fixed up. At that moment, the brunette with his mask down pulled Dong-Hyuk sharply by his shirt collar and shouted that he was crazy. The brunette was about to use physical punishment, but the guy with the ponytail stopped him. Jeop intervened in the conversation and said that hitting someone who isn't scared isn't fun at all. After patting Dong-Hyuk on the shoulder, Jeop asked if he was ready for the game. Dong-Hyuk replied that it was better to talk about such things in advance. Jeop noted that finding players is not as easy as it seems. Jun-Hyuk was chosen as the first player. Oh, Jun-Hyuk said that the nerd better get ready. Jeop adjusted his glasses, looked at Jun-Hyuk's funny face once more, and laughed loudly. Then he drew the attention of the others, so that they all laughed too. When they started talking about the opponent, Dong-hyuk told everyone to look in the corner. The brunette thought he was going to be a competitor at first, but he was quickly asked to step back. As soon as he stepped back, everyone saw Shin-soo in front of them. Ji-yeop sighed heavily. He turned to Dong-hyuk and said with menace in his voice that he better not joke like that again. Soo was at his limit. Fear clutched his chest and sweat poured down his face, but he knew he had to go out and play. There was no turning back. A few hours ago, he was caught in the men's room. His classmates got straight to the point. They offered to play in a match. Soo nervously looked away and quietly said that he couldn't. He doesn't even know how to fight. He said that he would just get beaten up in front of everyone. That's when Chae Hyo came forward and asked if he wanted to be like Gino. Specifically, does he want everyone to see videos of him getting beaten while he's in tears and snot? Or does he want to be beaten like a punching bag every day? The guys looked at him and asked, was he really willing to endure this humiliation for the next 3 years? In the next second, Dong-hyuk took a step forward. In a calm voice, he said that Oh Jun-hyuk was just an empty man. He grabbed Soo's hand and added that when Oh Jun got hit in the face, he immediately fell down, almost unconscious. Dong-hyuk looked straight into his eyes and said that if Soo wins, he will delete the video and forget everything. All you have to do is play one game. Soo raised his head and sighed heavily. He knew he was in trouble. He had known from the beginning, but he had done it anyway. The thought swirled around in my head. How about just getting hit and falling, quickly and without agony? At this time, Ji-yeop was going through the things the other students had slipped him. The box already contained watches, phones, and all sorts of appliances. When he voiced the price, 200,000 won for the phone, one guy erupted. Ji-yeop calmly replied that the phone was stolen, and it would be hard to sell it. Now was the perfect chance to make some money. The guy exhaled, agreed, and immediately bet all his money on Oh Young winning. Dong-hyuk turned to his own. How much do you have with you? Sung Ho-jun replied, he has 70,000 won. Dae-yeol said 80,000 won. Dong-hyuk looked at them and said, discount it. We'll bet everything. Shin-soo stood face to face with Oh-jun. The real fight was starting. One of the guys volunteered to be the referee. He quickly explained the rules. The main thing is not to hit the back of the head. He pointed to Oh-jun's counter and asked to correct his elbow. Oh-jun snorted and said he already knew everything. He didn't need any hints. Then the ref looked at everyone and asked them to focus on the fight. After a moment, he gave the command, begin. Oh-jun immediately rushed forward with a straight punch, his face skewed with anger. Soo froze. His heart was pounding. He covered his face with his hands, trying to protect himself. He didn't want to be beaten. But in that moment, his body triggered itself. Without thinking, Soo abruptly threw his fist forward and hit Oh-jun's cheek precisely. In a second, he was already lying on the floor, limp and exhausted. Soo stood there in complete shock. He didn't understand how he had managed to knock Oh-jun out with one punch. At that moment, he heard Oh-jun's voice. He said he was surprised. Oh-jun slowly rose to his feet, holding his cheek. He looked at Soo and said that he was actually going to hit him a couple of times and call it a day, but now he realized it wouldn't work that way. He then added that he would now try to make everything beautiful. Hearing this, Soo felt that maybe he really did have a chance. He felt hopeful. The tense battle continued. Oh-jun leaned forward slightly and took aim at Soo's abdomen, but he reacted quickly and blocked the attack. Soo put out the elbow of his left hand, not even giving his opponent a chance to come closer. But Oh-jun did not retreat. He threw his arm back sharply, intending to strike with all his might. When there were millimeters between Oh-jun's fist and Shin-soo's face, Soo had already mentally resigned himself to the blow. But at the last moment, his body triggered itself. He put the block down automatically. Ji-yeop, watching from the side, laughed out loud, noting that Oh-jun was moving much faster than he had expected. Oh-jun froze and looked at Soo in surprise. He was shocked. With all his speed, he still didn't hit. Shin-soo didn't understand how it came out either. He just stood there looking at his hands for a few seconds. Soo reflected on the fact that he always managed to block punches, even though he couldn't avoid them. Plus, when he put the block on, it didn't hurt him at all. He turned to Oh-jun and asked calmly, "Can I hit now?" Soo's words made Oh-jun even more agitated. He rushed forward and threw his fist at his opponent with fury, but misses. Soo regains the initiative and strikes with an uppercut from the bottom. Ji-yeop didn't hold back his emotions. He said Soo is a real killer cyborg. He laughed and added that a fight like this is just crazy. Soo confidently threw a powerful punch to Oh-jun's cheek. He didn't stop and began swinging his fists, fending off possible attacks. His fist throbbed with pain, but compared to what Oh-jun was feeling right now, it was nothing. Sensing that he was winning, Soo stood over Oh-jun and prepared to finish the fight. He almost hit, but Oh-jun managed to dodge at the last moment. Moreover, he was instantly at Soo's back, grabbed him by the neck and started choking him. "Who do you think you are?" Oh-jun shouted. The crowd immediately yelled back, cheering him on with loud shouts. Shinsu's eyes were rapidly turning dark. He was no longer in control of anything. That fight was lost. He fell to the floor without strength, not even trying to get up. It's been a little while since the match. Dong-yeok said with a smirk that he was curious whether Su could handle it or let him down. He now calmly admitted that Su had fought much better than he had expected. Dae-yeol intervened and said that Su made him lose money. Dong-yeok looked at him irritably and reminded him that he himself had leaked 100,000 won, and that he had leaked as much as 150 won. He then cast a glance at Su and asked if he would return their money. Su looked at them perplexed, and asked why on earth he should return anything. He recalled that Dong-yeok had promised not to touch him. Dong-yeok calmly replied that the promise was about victory. There was no victory. Dong-yeok said that if Su paid, he would personally protect him. After that, he and Dae-yeol turned around and left after saying goodbye to Shin-su. Su was left alone, full of silence and his own thoughts. At this time, Gino walked into the empty classroom. The entire classroom was completely deserted. He slowly walked over to the desk and was about to sit down. His gaze fell on the spot where Dong-yeok usually sat. After a little thought, he sat down at this desk, since it was free now. Sitting down, he exhaled heavily. My whole body trembled with overwhelming emotion. He muttered to the hooligans that they were complete assholes. Realizing that no one would hear him anyway, he didn't hold back. And he shouted into the void in a full voice, "Why don't you just shut up?" There was complete silence in the classroom. Gino looked at the sneaker print on the desk and muttered that Dong-yeok was a real puppy brat. At this time, there was a conversation going on in the school lab about Blob, a strange slime in a container. A blonde-haired student told his teacher that he wanted to choose Blob as a topic for a research paper. The teacher nodded and replied that he would give him an access card so he could come to the lab whenever he wanted. The guy looked at the container and noticed that the blob was smaller than it used to be. The teacher laughed and said that if he was so keen on this thing, he would soon start growing it himself. The apprentice frowned and wondered if someone could have stolen some of the slime mold. The teacher grinned and replied that there was no need for nonsense. At this moment, Shin-su walked to the door. He looked through the small window and quietly exhaled. Su was glad that he had come, because now at least something was beginning to clear up. Shin-su stood at the door of the lab and hesitated. He wondered if he should tell everything. Maybe together they could find a solution. After all, he didn't steal the slime ball. Gino did, which means he has nothing to fear. Su put his hand on the doorknob, about to enter, but suddenly Gino's voice sounded behind me. Su shuddered so violently that he almost fell down. In the lab, the teacher and student also heard some strange noise outside. Long slime molds suddenly burst out from Su's hand. They rushed towards Gino and covered his mouth at the same second. Su's entire arm turned into bundles that wrapped around Gino and prevented him from moving. Even Su was frightened. The slime lifted Gino into the air and slammed him into the wall. He couldn't scream or break free. The student decided to check out what was happening on the other side of the door. The blonde-haired guy came out of the lab and immediately noticed the shards of glass on the floor. All the windows were smashed to splinters. In the middle of this mess lay a small flower growing from the offshoots of a slime mold. He picked it up and frowned, scrutinizing it closely. Clenching it in his fist, the guy looked around as if expecting something. At this time, Gino and Su were sitting by the shore, discussing what had been going on lately. Su said that if he hadn't heard that conversation in the lab, he definitely wouldn't have believed that all this mayhem was because of the flu he ate yesterday. Su, a little concerned, asked Gino if his head was okay, referring to the bruise. Gino scratched the back of his head and replied that he was fine. Just a little bump when the backpack got caught. Su apologized sincerely, but Gino laughed and said it wasn't his fault. He had scared Su himself by coming up so unexpectedly from behind. Su nodded, agreeing that it was fine before, but now he was feeling very nervous. There was almost no strength left. Gino suggested that Su eat white mold, or more specifically, the fly agaric mushroom. He explained that the blob feeds on that and maybe Su should try it too. Su stated emphatically that he would never eat white mold. Gino reminded him that Su had eaten bread with mold in peace, and he had been fine. Su clutched his head and exclaimed that he was going crazy. He said that if that was true, he would have to look for white mold and eat it instead of normal food. Taking his briefcase, Su stood up and said he had to go. Before he left, he looked at Gino and asked him to keep everything he saw a secret. Gino raised his hand, promising he wouldn't tell anyone. Su thanked him and asked him to be careful. In the evening, Gino hurried home. He went into his room where he had left the blob, sat down next to him, still thinking about what had happened. Quickly grabbing the blob, Gino began to eat it. After what he saw, he realized that he now wanted to use the blob to fight back. Headmistress Yu Yun-ha informed Shin-su's mom that he hadn't been to school for 2 days already, and then he also came late. Mom was angry. To smooth things over, Su offered to help, to cook dinner or clean up, but his mother only looked at him and asked him if he thought his mom was completely stupid. She showed the torn t-shirt and demanded an explanation. Su froze. His mouth opened on its own in surprise, but then he remembered. The shirt had torn when the slime mold had burst out of his hand. He'd wanted to throw it away, but he'd thrown it in the wash out of habit. Mom asked if he was having trouble at school. Maybe his classmates were bullying him. Sue immediately shouted that it wasn't true. He grabbed the t-shirt and started pulling it in different directions, making excuses that the fabric was old so it tore so easily. Holding a t-shirt in one hand and a garbage bag in the other, he stated that it was embarrassing to even go outside in it, and he was going to throw it away. But his mom kept up. She stopped him and demanded an answer as to why he was skipping school then, if it wasn't about his classmates. The woman shouted, asking why he was lying. But at that moment, Sue had already gone out the door and slammed it loudly. Sue exhaled a sigh of relief. He tried his best not to let his mother know anything unnecessary. But suddenly his ears began to change. The familiar slime ball outgrowth sprang from them. At this time, Gino had already eaten the blob and was lying on the floor without strength. He barely touched the table as outgrowths began to emerge from his hand as well. He wasn't prepared for the fact that his whole arm suddenly turned into clots. The clots had already begun to slide down his face. Gino quietly pleaded for help, but the slime kept coming out of his fingers. After a moment, his lower jaw just slid down, and then the whole face began to slump, more and more outgrowths bursting out from within. After a couple minutes, all that was left of Gino was his clothes. Everything else was one huge mass of offshoots, sprawled across the room. At this time, Sue was lying in bed and looking at his face through the frontal. He was surprised that the common mushroom left no bruises or wounds on his skin. Even the pimples had disappeared. Looking at his clean skin, Sue thought that he was now purity itself. He stood up, picked up his phone, and took selfies. Looked at the photo. It turned out pretty good, but I didn't post it right away. First, I threw it into the editor. I narrowed the chin, stretched the shoulders a bit. Now it's a top. After finishing, Sue smiled contentedly. Yes, it was a little too much, but it was fine. He reached for the toilet paper and felt a strange tingling in his legs. He lowered his gaze and saw yellow growths coming out of his toes. Sue dropped his phone in shock, and it hit the tiles with a thud. The slime mold immediately began to spread between the seams. Sue assumed that the slime mold was just absorbing the mold from the floor. But he wasn't happy that it was now feeding on dirt. He lowered his head sadly, admitting it was gross. The morning of the new school day came. School children, one after another, hurried to classes. On the way to school, two friends were discussing the latest gossip. Suddenly, someone shoved the brunette's shoulder. She grabbed her shoulder and complained of pain. But when she saw who had crashed into her, she froze with surprise. Shinsu politely apologized. He said he was thinking and didn't notice her. The girl smiled and suggested that his mind must have gotten all mixed up before the exams, too. She said they should try to do well together. Afterward, the girlfriend said goodbye to him. When he left, the brunette embarrassedly admitted that she had already started looking for a place for their future wedding. When he left, the brunette embarrassedly admitted that she had already started to look for a place for their future wedding. Head girl Yu Yun. Ha walked into the classroom and heard several students discussing Shinsu's face. One of the girls said that maybe he was on a diet. The other girl immediately argued that no diet could change his face that fast. At that time, Yu Yun Ha came closer and calmly inquired about what was going on. Hearing the head girl's voice, the students parted so that she could look at Sue as well. Yu Yun Ha froze when she saw his face. She didn't recognize him at first. His face was different, his chin narrower, his features sharper. Sue looked at her in surprise and called her by name. Only after hearing the familiar voice and seeing the facial features did Yu Yun Ha quietly say, "Shinsu." At this time, Gino sat curled up in his room, trying to comprehend what was happening. He shook his arm to the side, checking to make sure he was okay. Then he grabbed his briefcase and tried to calm down. He told himself that everything would be all right. Gino decided that he should talk to Sue. After all, he had already experienced something similar. He was walking through an alley on his way to school and noticed three guys chatting amongst themselves. As Gino walked by, one of them turned his attention to him. The brunette looked out and said that he and Gino hadn't seen each other in a long time. The guy walked up to Gino and asked with a smile if he wanted to see something really cool. Then he introduced Gino to his friends. The blonde guy told Gino that he was studying with Jin Dong-yuk. The brunette put his hand on his shoulder and added to tell Dong-yuk to chill out. If he doesn't understand, they'll help him. The guy went on to say that if Dong-yuk so much as laid a finger on Gino, he would personally visit their school. The brunette ran his hand over Gino's head, grinned, and said that he had obviously grown since they hadn't seen each other. Gino, in a shaky voice, muttered that he had to get to school or he would be late. The guys started laughing loudly, showing how naive he looked. The brunette looked at Gino and let him go. But after a moment he knocked Gino down sharply and said he could go while they were still kind. Gino looked at the guy in surprise, not realizing what was going on. The brunette kicked him on his backpack and pushed him forward, repeating that he'd better leave. Gino didn't understand why he was suddenly hit. The thought flashed through his mind that he was facing some kind of fiend who was beating and laughing as if it was the right thing to do. But then he realized that for him, that was probably what was normal. The brunette moved closer and told his friends that he would deal with Gino first, and then move on. Suddenly, Gino's hand turned into a mass of offshoots. He swung around and shouted, "Stop! Stop hitting me, asshole!" And the next moment, his hand crashed into the brunette's face. In class, the teacher said that someone broke the windows outside the lab. It looks like it was done on purpose. He added that he fixed the windows but asked not to touch them so as not to hurt himself, and advised to go straight home after school. The teacher reminded us that the exam was coming up, so everyone needed to prepare. Song Hojun yawned loudly and said that everyone would definitely fail the exam. Dong-hyuk couldn't get Soo out of his mind. He couldn't believe that one could change his appearance so much in one day. Soo was getting more and more worried about Dong-hyuk. Suddenly, Soo heard a notification. He opened his phone and saw a message from a strange girl. He immediately asked who she was. She was upset that Soo didn't have her number and asked if he had always been this tall. Soo replied that he had woken up, and he was. The girl thought it was a joke and asked how to increase her height. Soo replied that you should drink more milk. Soo wondered why this girl he had never interacted with would suddenly text him and laugh off his boring replies. He realized that he had changed a lot in appearance because of that photo he had photoshopped himself. Everything changed as soon as Soo changed his appearance. People's reactions were shocking. Suddenly, Soo realized that he hadn't seen Gino all day. Meanwhile, Gino looked at his trembling hand. Thanks to the power of the slime ball, he was able to knock out the bully with one punch. The blonde man cried out fearfully, "Did you see what happened to his arm?" The friend replied, "Yes, I saw." Gino shouted back loudly that the guys were just imagining things. As he started to run away, he shouted, "I didn't do anything!" But Gino was too slow to avoid the motorcycle that was bearing right at him. The motorcycle was closing in, seconds to go. The motorcyclist ended up running over Gino, hitting him in the face with his front tire. After a few hours, classes ended and the students went home. Yoon-ha excitedly asked Soo if Gino answered her call. She couldn't reach him. Shin-soo asked if she was tired of worrying about everyone. Yoon-ha replied that it was her duty as the head girl. She added that she treats Gino and Dong-hyuk the same. "They're infuriating with their childish behavior," she said, then recalled. But when Soo hit the ball, it was funny. Shin-soo had already regretted that incident many times. He didn't think anyone would appreciate his throw. They froze as they saw Gino peeking out from behind a tree. Gino waved and asked how they were doing. Yoon-ha noticed that his clothes were badly torn and worriedly asked what was wrong with him. Soo asked why Gino wasn't at school, and Gino was surprised when he looked at Soo, as Soo had gotten much taller. Shin-soo really grew a lot in one day. Yoon-ha advised Gino to go to the hospital first thing. When a motorcyclist was riding on Gino and hit him hard, Gino got up and pushed the motorcyclist off with his bike. The motorcycle flipped over, and the motorcyclist flew out and rolled on the ground. Despite the blow, Gino recovered quickly and healed his wounds, all thanks to the slime bug's power. Gino replied that, like Soo, he could heal himself. Those words shocked Shin-soo. A little time passed, and Gino told Soo what had happened. Shin-soo anxiously asked, "What were you thinking when you said that in front of Yoon-ha?" Soo was also worried that Gino ate that blob without knowing what would happen to him. Soo reminded, "You heard me yesterday. I'd throw it away if I were you." Gino clutched the briefcase to himself and realized that Soo couldn't even imagine how he felt at that moment. He said he was bullied every day, which caused him to freak out a lot, and now he's on medication for bipolar disorder. Gino admitted that he was scared. He was afraid that he would eat the mushroom and nothing would change. But now he was happy because there was a change, and the first thing he wanted to do was to tell Shin-soo about it. Soo grabbed his face when he heard that. He said that he seemed to have lost his mind. He added that he was already having a hard time, and now he was worried about Gino. Soo leaned over and said that it was time for him to go to the academy. He, having already learned how to control the slime ball, decided to give Gino some advice. Soo showed how the outgrowths came out of his body and lifted the briefcase. He explained that even in unexpected situations, one must be able to bring the creature back inside. "You need to learn control first," Soo said. At this time, head girl Yoon-ha was trying to call Soo. Soo didn't pick up the phone and the girl started to worry. Soo crouched on the floor, cross-legged, and demonstrated how he controlled the outgrowths of the blob to hold several stones at once. Soo concentrated, and the blob's outgrowths began to move, holding the stones in place. He released his hands forward, and the rocks that held the offshoots were right in front of him. Soo made a few maneuvers and ordered the rocks to be released. They fell with a thud, shattering the drink cans. One can was left among the trash. Soo laughed happily and shouted, "Did you see that, Gino? It's cool, isn't it? Slowly they're starting to listen to me." Gino smiled widely and confirmed that it was really cool. Gino decided to try it himself. He concentrated on his body, trying to control the outgrowths. After a moment, many slime ball outgrowths emerged from his body, clinging tightly to the beam. Wiggling on the offshoot, he shouted happily, "I can do it too!" But a second later, Gino began to fall, and the spurs could not support his weight, slipping off the beam. Gino collapsed onto the shards of cans with a clatter and screamed in pain. Sue came over and asked if everything was all right. Then he said he should have been slower. Gino looked at his hand and said he just relaxed and lost control. He noticed that if he was scared or hurt, the creature became slow. Sue noticed that Gino's head had become somewhat bulging. Gino felt a pain in his head, grabbed his head and screamed. Sue asked in surprise, "Is the blob moving?" The boys realized that the creature was alive. On the way home, Gino felt the world blurring around him. He felt empty. In his heart, Gino wondered, what if Sue and I aren't human anymore? But in spite of everything, he was happy that he absolutely didn't care now. In the gym, G-Yop was playing basketball and asked his brunette friend how much time had passed since the last game. The one replied that it had been about a week. G-Yop chuckled and said that the guy from that match's name was kind of Shin Soo, and added that it was funny watching his first fight. After intercepting the ball from a distracted player, G-Yop noticed that even though Sue had held on for a long time, the crowd had gotten too small, and a normal match had not come out, causing sales to drop. He rushed to the ring and with a leap sent the ball into the goal. The ball went through the ring and rolled down. He was calmly picked up by Dong-Yop. When G-Yop called his name, Dong-Yop returned the ball and said no more kids. G-Yop called some schoolboy over, made him bend over, put his foot on his back, and said with a sneer that his foot had just slipped. Then he turned to Dong-Hyuk and said he'd heard about the first year's run-in with the Gomungo boys, and added that in his time such antics wouldn't have even occurred to him, thanks to him. The boy grinned. He hated being condescending. Dong-Hyuk said without emotion to gather the best. He would take the audience. Tossing the ball on his finger, G-Yop asked him to pick a sunny day. He can't stand overcast weather. He knelt down on his knees dribbling the ball and said, "Get that guy from the last match to come too. He wants to see him in action again." At recess, Chae-hyo was passing out videos of Dong-Hyuk beating up Sue around the hallway. Putting his arm around one's shoulder, he said he had edited the video and would show it for 5,000 won. He added that his friend was getting a discount. Shaitan was furious. It pissed him off, the way he pretended to be a goody-goody. Everyone in the class sat with their faces blanked out. And Gino returned. The atmosphere immediately sat down. Chae-hyo stepped closer and smirked. And he hit Gino on the back of the head with a swinging kick, and he bent from the blow. Chae-hyo said with a chuckle that Gino ran away like a coward and now pretends like he doesn't recognize them. Seeing that he was silent, Chae-hyo tapped him lightly on the neck and asked him if it hurt. At the same moment, Gino grabbed his arm. He stood up, looking straight ahead, and said sharply, "I don't apologize." Chae-hyo was stunned. Was it definitely Gino? The one was suddenly taller than him, and it was even more confusing. Gino swung around and, raising his voice, added, "You don't apologize to me either." It was followed by a powerful punch to the cheek. Chae-hai flew to the side and his glasses flew off his face. He crashed face first into the floor with a thud. Shatten ran up to Chae-hyo in a panic, shouting his name. Pressing his cheek, Chae-hyo asked furiously, not believing what was happening, if Gino had punched him in the face. Unable to contain his anger, he jumped up and sprinted into the fray. Calling Gino crazy, Chae-hyo put his fist against his cheek and pressed down roughly. Then he grabbed Gino by the collar and swung, but he managed to get his arm up and block the blow. Memories flashed through Gino's mind. How recently Chae-hyo had beaten him without mercy. He wasn't going to take it anymore. Grabbing Chae-hyo by the shirt, he took the initiative. Gino clenched his fist and struck without hesitation. His fist slammed into Chae-hyo's face, and the force of the blow made his face twist. Without letting go of his shirt, Gino asked why they keep picking him. "Just to feign strength in front of others?" he asked, driving an uppercut into Chae-hyo's stomach. From the blow, Chae-hyo collapsed to his knees, grabbed his stomach, and screamed in pain. Gino swung his foot in, aiming for his face, but Chae-hyo managed to cover himself with his hands. Gino shouted that he almost broke his head trying to figure out why him. He thought maybe because he wasn't like everyone else, so he should get one every day. He grabbed Chae-hyo by the hair. Lifting his head by the hair, Gino pulled his foot back, preparing to strike. He shouted that he was a human being like everyone else and slammed his knee right into Chae-hyo's face. No matter how much he thought about it, Gino couldn't understand why everyone was divided into normal and extra. He pressed Chae-hyo's face harder against his knee in fury. Suddenly I felt someone's touch. It was Chae-hyo's friend. He tried to stop Gino. He abruptly grabbed him in a chokehold and yelled for him to stop. Said Chae-hyo has already apologized and doesn't deserve that. Gino shouted that it wasn't a real apology and started to unclench his hand, breaking free of his grip. Pushing himself away, he muttered through his teeth that the brown-haired man shouldn't protect Chae-hyo. He added that the man was just using him as he pleased, and slapped him hard. Gino stood at the desk, grabbed it from both sides, and declared that he was addressing everyone. Those who looked down on him, and those who simply remained silent while he was being humiliated. Raising the desk above his head, he shouted out that he would show them all. Chehyo cried and begged Gino to spare him. And Gino, full of anger, sent him to hell with hatred in his voice. Suddenly he froze. A familiar voice sounded behind him. It was Shinsu. He touched Gino's shoulder and called out to him. Quietly but anxiously, he asked what was happening to him. Su asked Gino to stop this madness and put the desk back in place. Gino obeyed and carefully returned the desk to its place. Su patted his shoulder, showing his support. Gino, frustrated, said Su could have put it differently. Gino pushed Su to the side and ordered, "Make way, let me pass." After class, Su sat with Yun-ha on the bench. The head teacher said that Gino was starting to scare her. She added that she's worried because she knows Dong-hyuk won't let it go unnoticed. Su calmed her down, saying that everything would be fine since these guys haven't been bothering him lately. The conversation turned to Su. Yun-ha was surprised to see that he had changed a lot. His face was different, and his height had increased. Embarrassed, she said that the situation with Gino was awful, and added that something weird has been going on with the guys lately. Su recalled the guys who grew up over the vacations, but Yun-ha disagreed, saying it wasn't the same. Soon the bus pulled up to the bus stop. While Yun-ha was walking to the bus, Su said that his mom told the head teacher not to call if he missed class. Yun-ha, hearing that, asked him not to lie. Shinsu abruptly turned around when he heard someone call out to him from behind. He saw a blonde-haired guy sitting on a bench. The guy rubbed his palm against his palm and said he was having a hard time finding Su with his new change in appearance. Su was surprised to ask who he was, and Yun-ha looked at the stranger carefully. The stranger opened his mouth but immediately fell silent. He parted his palms, and outgrowths appeared between them. After a moment, an image began to emerge from the offshoots. Yun-ha asked Su, "What are you doing? Let's go faster." Shinsu continued to stare at the face made of offshoots. The guy showing off his art said he knew Shinsu. The face from the offshoots was very similar to Su's face. The stranger stated, "I know everything about you," which scared Shinsu a lot. Soo-hyun introduced himself and began to narrate. He told me how he found the sample among the shards of glass outside the lab. He also explained how he searched for Shinsu based on the mushroom's residual memories. Soo-hyun added that the fungus develops through the host's body and grows with it. You could call it symbiosis. Although Soo-hyun wasn't sure about the possibility of a cure at the current stage, he said some things have already changed. Shinsu felt calmer for the first time in a long time. As they approached the vending machine, Soo-hyun asked if Shinsu wanted something to drink. Shinsu replied that he wouldn't mind any drink. Choosing a drink, Shinsu asked, "How do you know all this?" Soo-hyun handed Shinsu the jar and explained that he was in charge of the research. He added that he plans to find a way to use this blob in medicine because the fungus has excellent regenerative abilities. The blonde-haired guy said that while studying the mushroom, he realized that his research specimen was unusual. After the procedure of injecting mushroom cells into a man's blood vessels, he noticed that the amputated limbs were regrowing. And not only do they grow back, but they gain unprecedented strength. As a result, the body acquires the ability to deform freely. Listening to the story, goosebumps ran down Shinsu's body. He couldn't believe that someone could conduct experiments on humans. It was crazy. The blonde-haired guy suddenly confessed that some of the samples he was working with had escaped from the lab. Shinsu exclaimed that this was a serious matter. Soo-hyun nodded in agreement and added that they were mostly people with disabilities or those who were sentenced to prison time. He said that if everything came out, a lot of people would be in danger. Shinsu didn't know what to say, but still clarified if catching those people would solve the problem. Soo-hyun replied with a dejected expression, "Most likely yes." The boys remained seated on the bench, contemplating the situation. Soon, Shinsu felt a strange gaze. He turned around. The blonde-haired guy's face changed, and he said with a crazed look, "That goes for you too." Shinsu flinched at those words, but it was too late to escape. Soo-hyun grabbed him in seconds, his legs tied up and his body completely immobilized, his mouth covered so he wouldn't scream. Shinsu tried to break free, twitching, but it was all in vain. Soo-hyun apologized and explained that one way to catch the fugitives was to immobilize them. "Although there is another way. Take over," he added. Soo-hyun asked for some patience, and the offshoot started to squeeze Shinsu's neck. The brats squeezed Shinsu's body even harder, and Soo-hyun asked if there were any witnesses. When he learned of Gino from the slime bug's memories, he noted that he was unfortunately unwilling to take any chances. Shinsu rolled his eyes, already barely keeping himself conscious. Soo-hyun calmly told Shinsu that there was no need to worry. He would take care of Gino.